I was 82 years old when my own family tried to steal everything I worked for my entire life. The worst part? They smiled while they did it, patting my hand and calling me grandma like they loved me, all while planning to take every penny I had. But what they didn't know was that this old woman still had a few tricks up her sleeve, and the secret I'd been keeping for 60 years was about to change everything. It started on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember because the leaves were just starting to turn, and I was sitting in my favorite chair by the window, watching the neighborhood kids walk to school. My daughter Linda burst through my front door without even knocking, followed by my son Robert and my daughter-in-law Patricia. Behind them came my grandson Michael, who barely looked up from his phone to acknowledge me. "Mom, we need to talk," Linda announced, setting a thick manila folder on my coffee table with an authoritative thud. Her tone was the same one she'd used when she was 12 and trying to convince me she hadn't broken my favorite vase. I set down my cup of tea and looked at the three of them. Well, for if you counted Michael, though he seemed more interested in whatever was on his screen than in visiting his grandmother. "Good morning to you too, dear. Would anyone like some coffee?" "This is serious, Mom," Robert said, loosening his tie like he was preparing for battle. "We've been talking, and we're worried about you." Patricia nodded vigorously, her perfectly styled blonde hair bouncing with each movement. "Emily, sweetie, you're not getting any younger, and living alone in this big house. Well, it's just not safe anymore. I'd lived in this house for 47 years. My husband Charles and I had bought it when Linda was just 5 years old, back when the neighborhood was full of young families and the American dream felt within reach. We'd raised our children here, hosted countless Christmas mornings and birthday parties, weathered storms both literal and metaphorical within these walls. The idea that it wasn't safe seemed absurd to me. "I'm managing just fine," I said calmly. "Mrs. Henderson next door checks on me every day, and I have my medical alert bracelet. But what if something happens?" Linda pressed, sitting down on the edge of my sofa without being invited. "What if you fall and can't get to the phone? What if you forget to turn off the stove?" I wanted to remind her that I'd been cooking for 70 years without burning the house down, but I kept that observation to myself. Instead, I asked, "What exactly are you proposing?" Robert cleared his throat and opened the manila folder. Inside were what looked like dozens of legal documents, all with official letterheads in tiny print that made my eyes strain just looking at them. "We've found you a lovely assisted living facility, Meadowbrook Manor. It's got everything you could want: meals provided, activities, medical staff on site 24 hours a day. And it's expensive," Patricia added with false cheer. "Which is why we need to make some arrangements with your assets." That word assets hit my ears like fingernails on a chalkboard. In my 82 years, I'd learned that when people start talking about your assets, they're usually planning to take them from you. "What kind of arrangements?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Linda reached over and patted my hand in that condescending way that made my skin crawl. "Just some paperwork to make sure everything is handled properly. We want to make sure you're taken care of, and that means making sure your finances are managed by someone who can handle all the complicated stuff." Michael finally looked up from his phone long enough to add, "Yeah, Grandma, you don't want to have to worry about all that boring money stuff, right?" I looked at my grandson, 25 years old, living in his parents' basement, working part-time at a video game store, and wondered when he'd become an expert on financial management. But I simply nodded and said, "Show me what you want me to sign." What followed was an hour of the most condescending explanation I'd ever endured. Linda, who'd gotten a C+ in high school algebra, suddenly became a financial advisor, explaining to me how a power of attorney would simplify things. Robert, who'd asked me to co-sign his car loan just 3 years earlier, lectured me about the importance of proper estate planning. Patricia, who'd never worked a day in her life and spent money like water, talked about fiscal responsibility. They used phrases like "for your own good," and "we just want what's best for you," while sliding document after document in front of me. Power of attorney papers that would give them complete control over my bank accounts. Property transfer documents that would sign my house over to them. Investment portfolio transfers that would move my retirement savings into their names, for safekeeping. "Just sign the papers, Grandma," Michael said when I hesitated over a particularly complex-looking document. "It's all boring legal stuff anyway." But I hadn't lived through 8 decades, raised 2 children, buried a husband, and survived the Great Depression by being stupid or naive. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, and I'd learned long ago to trust my instincts. I need some time to think about this, I said, closing the folder. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Linda's smile became brittle. Mom, we've explained everything. What's there to think about? It's a big decision, I replied. Surely you can give an old woman a few days to consider it. Robert and Patricia exchanged a look that they thought I didn't catch. It was the same look Charles used to give me when he was planning to surprise me with something. Except this surprise didn't feel like it would end with birthday cake and presents. Of course, Mom, Robert said with forced patience. But don't take too long. The spot at Meadowbrook Manor won't wait forever. After they left, taking their manila folder with them but leaving me with copies of everything to review, I sat in my chair and thought about the family I'd raised. Linda had been such a sweet child, always bringing me dandelions she'd picked from the yard and insisting they were the most beautiful flowers in the world. Robert had been my little protector, determined to fix anything that was broken and help anyone who needed it. Where had that gone wrong? I thought about Charles, who'd been gone for 12 years now. What would he think of his children trying to manipulate their mother this way? He'd always said our biggest mistake was being too generous with the kids, always bailing them out of trouble instead of letting them learn from their mistakes. Maybe he'd been right. That evening, I called my neighbor Mrs. Henderson. At 78, she was 4 years younger than me but infinitely more suspicious of everyone's motives. Dorothy, I said when she answered, I need to ask you something. If your children wanted you to sign papers giving them control of all your money, would you do it? Hell no, she replied without hesitation. Emily, please tell me your kids aren't trying to pull that nonsense. I told her about the morning's visit, and by the time I finished, Dorothy was practically shouting into the phone. Those ungrateful little vultures. Emily, you listen to me. You don't sign anything without having your own lawyer look at it first. Better yet, don't sign anything at all. But what if they're right? I asked. What if I am too old to manage my own affairs? Sweetheart, yesterday you balanced your checkbook, organized your medication for the week, and helped me figure out how to use my smartphone. Does that sound like someone who can't manage her own affairs? Dorothy had a point. I might be 82, but my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. I still did my own grocery shopping, paid my own bills, and managed my own investments that had grown considerably over the years, thanks to some very smart decisions I'd made decades earlier. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything my family didn't know about me. They saw me as just Grandma, the sweet old lady who baked cookies and sent birthday cards. They had no idea about the choices I'd made, the secrets I'd kept, or the resources I had at my disposal. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years. I got dressed in my best suit navy blue with small pearl buttons, the one I'd worn to Charles's funeral, and drove myself to downtown Chicago. My destination was a building I hadn't entered since 1987, but muscle memory guided me through the familiar marble lobby to the elevator bank. The law offices of Sterling, Blackwood and Associates occupied the entire 32nd floor, and walking through those doors felt like stepping back in time. The receptionist, a young woman who couldn't have been older than Michael, looked at me with polite confusion. I'm here to see James Sterling, I announced. Do you have an appointment, ma'am? Tell him Emily Patterson is here. He'll see me. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from a man I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. James Sterling was 75 now, his hair completely white and his face marked with the lines that come from decades of high-stakes legal battles. But his eyes were as sharp as ever, and when he saw me, they lit up with genuine warmth. Emily Patterson, he said, standing and coming around his desk to embrace me. I wondered if I'd ever see you again. Hello, James. I need your help. He gestured for me to sit in one of the comfortable leather chairs by his window. Outside, Chicago stretched out below us, busy and bustling and completely unaware that Emily Patterson was about to make some very important decisions. Tell me everything, he said. So I did. I told him about Linda and Robert and Patricia and Michael showing up with their folder full of documents. I told him about their condescending explanations and their insistence that I needed to be taken care of. I told him about the assisted living facility they picked out and their plans to manage my assets. James listened without interruption, but I could see his jaw tightening with each detail. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Emily," he said finally, "do you remember what you told me back in 1963? Of course I remembered. It was the day that changed my life forever. The day I made a decision that I'd kept secret from everyone, including my own family, for 60 years. I told you that I wanted to make sure my children never had to worry about money," I said. "But I also wanted to make sure they never took it for granted. And do you remember what we set up?" I smiled for the first time in days. "I remember everything." James pulled out a thick file from his desk drawer. A file with my name on it that was easily twice as thick as the one Linda had brought to my house. "Then you know that your children have no idea what they're dealing with. What my family didn't know, what no one knew except for James and me, was that Emily Patterson wasn't just a sweet grandmother with a nice house and a comfortable retirement account. Emily Patterson was the anonymous benefactor behind dozens of scholarships at 3 different universities. Emily Patterson owned significant shares in several major corporations. Emily Patterson had spent the last 60 years quietly building a financial empire that would have made their heads spin. It had started in 1963, when Charles was offered a promotion that required us to move to California. I was pregnant with Robert at the time, and had just started working as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company. The owner, a kind man named Samuel Goldman, had taken a liking to me and was sorry to see me go. "Emily," he'd said on my last day, "I want to offer you something. I'm about to expand the business, and I need investors. Most people want to put in thousands of dollars, but I'd be willing to accept whatever you can afford. Even $50 would help." $50 was a lot of money for us in 1963, but something about Samuel's quiet confidence in his business plan appealed to me. Charles thought I was crazy, but I gave Samuel $50 and became a tiny shareholder in Goldman Manufacturing. 5 years later, Goldman Manufacturing was bought by a larger company for 20 times its original value. My $50 investment was suddenly worth $1,000. More money than I'd ever seen at one time. But instead of spending it, I did something that surprised even me. I took that $1,000 and started looking for other small companies that needed investors. I studied business journals and financial reports. I attended shareholder meetings and asked questions. I became very good at spotting companies that were about to become very successful. By 1975, my investments were worth $50,000. By 1985, they were worth $500,000. By 1995, I was a millionaire, though I never told my family. I lived the same modest lifestyle, drove the same reliable car, and shopped at the same grocery stores. But quietly, carefully, I continued to build wealth. The money wasn't for me, it was insurance. Insurance against my children ever being desperate enough to make bad decisions. Insurance against my grandchildren having to take out crushing student loans. Insurance against anyone in my family ever having to choose between medical care and financial security. But I'd also learned, watching other wealthy families, that money handed over too easily often did more harm than good. So I'd structured everything very carefully. My children would inherit significant amounts when they turned 50, old enough to be responsible with it. My grandchildren would have college funds and down payment assistance for their first homes, but only if they demonstrated responsibility and kindness. The house, my retirement accounts, my obvious assets. Those were just the tip of the iceberg. The real wealth was hidden in trusts and investment accounts that my family had no idea existed. "So what do you want to do about this situation with your children?" James asked. I thought about Linda's condescending smile and Robert's lectures about fiscal responsibility. I thought about Patricia's casual dismissal of my intelligence and Michael's assumption that I was too old to understand boring legal stuff. "I want to teach them a lesson," I said. "But first, I want to see exactly what they're planning to do with my money, once they get their hands on it." James smiled. The same smile he'd worn back when we first met, when I was a young woman with $50 and big dreams. "Emily Patterson, you always were one step ahead of everyone else." We spent the next 3 hours planning. James had connections, private investigators, forensic accountants, people who could find out exactly what financial troubles my children might be hiding. By the time I left his office, I had a strategy. But more importantly, I had something I'd been missing for months. I felt like myself again. Not just grandma. Not just a sweet old lady to be patronized and managed. I felt like Emily Patterson, the woman who had built an empire $50 at a time, and never let anyone tell her what she couldn't do. The drive home gave me time to think about how I wanted to handle this. My children were planning to take advantage of me, but I was curious about why. Linda and Robert had both had comfortable middle-class upbringings. I'd paid for their college educations without them having to take out loans. I'd helped them with down payments on their first homes. When Linda got divorced, I'd quietly helped her with legal fees and temporary living expenses. When Robert's first business failed, I'd helped him get back on his feet. So why were they so desperate for money now that they were willing to manipulate their own mother? I was about to find out. That evening Linda called. "Hi, Mom. Have you had a chance to think about those papers?" "I'm still considering it," I said. "It's a big decision." "I know, but Mom, we really need to get this sorted out soon. The facility is holding the spot, but they need confirmation by Friday." Friday was 3 days away. "Interesting. What's the rush, dear?" "Oh, these places fill up fast. We just want to make sure you get the best care possible." After I hung up, I called James. "Friday," I said when he answered. "Can your people find out what's so urgent about Friday?" "Already on it," he replied. "I should have some information for you tomorrow." Wednesday morning brought Dorothy Henderson to my front door with a coffee cake and a suspicious expression. "Emily, I've been thinking about what you told me, and something doesn't add up." "What do you mean?" "Well, I ran into Patricia at the grocery store yesterday, and she was buying champagne. Expensive champagne. When I mentioned seeing her, she got all flustered and said something about celebrating a new business venture." "A new business venture? Very interesting. Did she say what kind of business?" "Something about Michael finally getting his life together. She seemed very excited about it." That afternoon, James called with information that made my blood boil. His investigator had discovered that Michael had been promised financing for a restaurant franchise. A very expensive restaurant franchise, with a down payment due on Friday. The financing was contingent on having a certain amount of collateral, specifically real estate. My real estate. But that wasn't all. Linda was 3 months behind on her mortgage and facing foreclosure. Robert's current business was failing, and he owed significant money to several creditors. Patricia had run up credit card debt that would have made my head spin. They weren't just planning to put me in assisted living for my own good. They were planning to solve all their financial problems with my money, and they were counting on me being too old and confused to understand what was happening. Thursday evening, Linda, Robert, and Patricia showed up again, this time with Michael in tow, looking more interested in the proceedings. They also brought a notary, a stern-looking woman who set up her supplies on my dining room table like she was preparing for a business transaction. "Mom, we really need to get this taken care of tonight," Robert said without even saying hello. "The paperwork needs to be filed first thing in the morning." "I've been thinking about what you said," I replied calmly. "About how I'm too old to manage my own affairs." Linda's face lit up with relief. "Oh, Mom, you'll be so much happier once you don't have to worry about all these complicated financial things." "Before I sign anything," I said, "I'd like to understand exactly what you plan to do with my assets once they're transferred." The room went quiet. Patricia and Robert exchanged another one of those looks, and Linda's smile faltered slightly. "We'll make sure everything is handled properly," Robert said vaguely. "But specifically," I pressed, "what are your plans?" Michael, apparently not as good at deception as the adults, jumped in eagerly. "Well, we figured we could sell the house and use that money for the restaurant, and then use your investment accounts to—" "Michael," Patricia hissed, cutting him off. But it was too late. The cat was out of the bag, and suddenly everyone was talking at once. Linda was trying to explain that they'd only sell the house if absolutely necessary. Robert was insisting that any business investments would benefit the whole family. Patricia was babbling about how the restaurant would provide jobs and stability for everyone. I let them talk. I let them tie themselves in knots with contradictory explanations and obvious lies. And then when they were all looking at me expectantly, waiting for me to pick up the pen and sign away my life's work, I said the words that changed everything. "I think it's time I told you all a secret I've been keeping for 60 years. The room fell silent. Even the notary looked up from her paperwork. "What kind of secret, Mom?" Linda asked nervously. I walked over to my desk and pulled out a manila folder of my own, one that was considerably thicker than the one they brought. I set it on the coffee table next to their documents and opened it slowly. The secret, I said, is that your mother isn't the naive old woman you think she is. The first document I pulled out was a portfolio statement showing investment holdings worth $0.3 million. I watched their eyes widen as they tried to process the numbers. This is just one account, I said calmly. There are several others. The next document was a property deed. Not for my house, but for a small office building downtown that I'd purchased 15 years earlier and had been quietly collecting rent on ever since. Mom, Robert said weakly, what is all this? This is what happens when someone spends 60 years making smart financial decisions instead of asking their mother for money every time they get in trouble. I pulled out more documents. Bank statements showing healthy balances in multiple accounts. Stock certificates for companies they'd actually heard of. Trust documents outlining scholarship funds I'd established and charitable contributions I'd been making for decades. The secret, I continued, is that I've been wealthy for most of your adult lives. Wealthy enough that none of you would ever have had to worry about money if you'd just been patient and responsible. Linda's face had gone pale. Mom, I don't understand. If you have all this money, why didn't you ever tell us? Because I wanted to see what kind of people you'd become on your own, I replied. I wanted to know that when you inherited wealth, you'd use it wisely instead of squandering it. I looked around the room at their shocked faces. Patricia looked like she was about to be sick. Michael was staring at the portfolio statement like it might disappear if he blinked. Robert was opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water. But here's what I discovered, I said, my voice getting stronger with each word. Instead of becoming responsible adults, you became people who would lie to and manipulate an elderly woman for money. You became people who would put their own mother in a nursing home not because she needed care, but because it would be convenient for your financial plans. Mom, that's not, Linda started. Don't, I interrupted. Just don't. I know about Michael's restaurant deal. I know about Linda's mortgage problems. I know about Robert's business debts and Patricia's credit cards. I know exactly why you need my money by Friday. The silence in the room was deafening. The notary was looking around like she was wondering if she should leave. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. You're going to take your papers and leave my house. You're going to call Meadowbrook Manor and tell them I won't be needing their services. And you're going to think very carefully about how you want to proceed from here. But Mom, Robert said desperately, we were just trying to help you. No, you were trying to help yourselves. There's a difference. I gathered up their documents and handed them back to Robert. I'm not signing anything tonight. In fact, I'm not sure I'll ever sign anything you put in front of me again. Linda started crying, actual tears, though I wasn't sure if they were from guilt or disappointment. Mom, please, we can work this out. Can we? I asked. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like my children see their mother as nothing more than a source of money to solve their problems. Patricia finally found her voice. Emily, you have to understand we're desperate. I understand desperation, I replied. What I don't understand is betrayal. The notary packed up her supplies and left without a word. One by one, my family followed her out, until only Michael remained. He stood in my doorway looking like a lost child, despite being 25 years old. Grandma, he said quietly, I'm sorry. It was the first apology I'd heard all evening, and it came from the person I'd expected it from least. I know you are, sweetheart, I said gently, but sorry doesn't fix what you all tried to do to me. After they left, I sat in my chair and looked out at the neighborhood I'd called home for nearly 50 years. The streetlights were coming on, and families were settling in for the evening. Normal families who probably didn't spend their time plotting to steal from their elderly relatives. The next morning, James Sterling called. How did it go? About as well as expected, I replied. They were shocked, then angry, then desperate. What do you want to do now? I've been thinking about that all night. I could simply cut them out of my will and leave everything to charity. I could use my wealth to help other people's children instead of my own ungrateful offspring. It would serve them right for trying to manipulate me. But despite everything, they were still my children. Linda was still the little girl who brought me dandelions. Robert was still my boy who wanted to fix everything. They'd made terrible choices, but maybe it wasn't too late for them to learn from those choices. I want to give them a chance to earn back my trust, I said finally. But they're going to have to work for it. Over the next few months, I watched my family scramble to deal with their financial problems on their own. Linda managed to negotiate a payment plan with her mortgage company and took on freelance bookkeeping work to make ends meet. Robert closed his failing business and took a job with a company that actually knew what it was doing. Patricia got her first job in 20 years. At a department store working retail. Michael's restaurant deal fell through, of course, but instead of moping about it, he enrolled in business classes at the community college and started working full-time at a restaurant to learn the industry from the ground up. They were learning what I'd learned decades earlier. That there's dignity in honest work and value in solving your own problems. I didn't make it easy on them. When Linda called asking for advice about her budget, I helped her with advice, not money. When Robert asked if I thought his new job was a good opportunity, I encouraged him to trust his own judgment. When Patricia complained about difficult customers, I reminded her that every job has its challenges. But I didn't give them money. Not a penny. 6 months after the night they tried to manipulate me into signing over my assets, Linda came to visit alone. She looked tired but healthier than she had in years. The kind of tired that comes from honest work rather than constant worry. "Mom," she said, "I owe you an apology." "Just one?" I asked with a slight smile. She laughed. And for a moment she sounded like the little girl I remembered. "Okay, I owe you about 1,000 apologies. What we did was wrong. What I did was wrong. Tell me what you've learned," I said. "I've learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was," she replied. "I've learned that I can solve my own problems if I work hard enough. And I've learned that trying to take shortcuts usually makes things worse, not better." It was a start. Over the following year, each of them came to me with similar conversations. Robert acknowledged that he'd been treating me like a bank instead of a mother. Patricia admitted that she'd never respected my intelligence and had seen me as an easy target. Even Michael, who'd shown the most remorse from the beginning, made a formal apology for his part in the scheme. But the real test came on my 84th birthday. Instead of the usual small family dinner, they threw me a surprise party. Not an expensive party. They still couldn't afford expensive, but a thoughtful one. Linda made my favorite cake from scratch. Robert brought photo albums and spent the evening telling stories about his childhood. Patricia, who'd never shown much interest in my history before, asked me to tell her about how I'd met her father-in-law. Michael gave me a gift he'd made himself. A wooden jewelry box with "World's Best Grandma" carved into the lid. It wasn't the money they'd spent, because they hadn't spent much, that touched me. It was the effort. It was the recognition that I was a person worth celebrating, not just a resource to be managed. That night, after everyone had gone home, I called James Sterling. "I think they've learned their lesson," I told him. "Are you sure?" he asked. "People don't usually change that much." "They haven't changed completely," I admitted. "But they've changed enough. They've learned that they can survive on their own, and they've remembered that I'm their mother, not their bank account. So what do you want to do?" I've been thinking about that for months. I want to start giving them opportunities to earn what they would have inherited anyway. Not handouts, opportunities. James understood immediately. He'd been managing my affairs long enough to know how my mind worked. Over the next few years, I began quietly offering my children chances to benefit from my wealth, but only if they proved they deserved it. When Linda mentioned wanting to start her own bookkeeping business, I offered to match whatever she could save for startup costs. It took her 2 years to save enough to qualify for the matching funds, but when she did, her business took off. When Robert proved himself at his new job and started talking about buying into the company, I offered to co-invest with him. As a business partner, not as his mother bailing him out. The investment did well for both of us. Patricia surprised everyone by discovering she had a talent for retail management. When the store where she worked was looking for investors to expand, I provided backing, in exchange for Patricia earning a management position and partial ownership. Michael's restaurant dream finally came true, but not the way he'd originally envisioned it. Instead of a fancy franchise, he opened a small neighborhood cafe with food He'd learned to cook during his years of working in the industry. I provided the down payment for his equipment, after he'd saved up 6 months of operating expenses on his own. Each of these investments came with conditions. They had to prove they could manage money responsibly before they got access to mine. They had to demonstrate genuine effort and commitment, not just need or desire. And most importantly, they had to treat me as a respected business partner, not as a grandmother who could be manipulated. The family dinners changed too. Instead of awkward conversations where everyone was wondering when I might need help managing my affairs, we talked about their businesses, their successes, their challenges. I became someone they came to for advice and wisdom, not just someone they visited out of obligation. Linda's bookkeeping business grew into a small accounting firm. Robert became a partner in his company and developed a reputation for ethical business practices. Patricia was promoted to regional manager and started teaching retail management courses at the community college. Michael's Cafe became a neighborhood institution, known for good food and community involvement. But the most important change was in how they saw me. I wasn't just Graham anymore. I was Emily Patterson, successful businesswoman, savvy investor, and matriarch of a family that had learned the value of honest work and mutual respect. On my 90th birthday, they threw me another party, and this time Michael stood up to make a speech. When I was 25, he said, I thought my grandmother was just a sweet old lady who baked cookies and sent birthday cards. I had no idea she was one of the smartest, strongest people I'd ever known. I'm grateful that she didn't let us get away with treating her badly, because if she had, we never would have learned to be better people. He paused and looked around the room at his parents, his aunt, his cousins who'd all learned similar lessons over the years. Grandma taught us that love isn't about giving someone everything they want, he continued. Real love is about helping someone become the best version of themselves, even if it means letting them struggle for a while. As I looked around the room at my family, my successful, responsible, grateful family, I thought about that day when they first tried to manipulate me into signing over my assets. At the time, I'd been hurt and angry, but looking back, I realized it had been a gift. It had been an opportunity to show them who I really was, and to help them become who they were meant to be. The secret I'd revealed that night wasn't just about my wealth. It was about my strength, my wisdom, and my unwillingness to be underestimated. They'd learned that Emily Patterson wasn't someone to be managed or manipulated. They'd learned that respect had to be earned, not assumed. And most importantly, they'd learned that the best inheritance I could give them wasn't money. It was the knowledge that they were capable of creating their own success. These days, when people ask me about the secret to a successful family, I tell them it's the same as the secret to successful investing. You have to be patient, you have to be smart, and you have to know the difference between helping someone and enabling them. My children thought they were getting one over on a confused old woman. Instead, they got a lesson in what it means to earn respect, create value, and build something meaningful with your own hands. And that lesson was worth far more than any amount of money I could have simply handed over. The manila folder they brought to my house that October day had been full of papers designed to take away my power and independence. The folder I'd shown them in return was full of documents that demonstrated exactly how powerful and independent I'd always been. Sometimes the most important secrets aren't the ones we keep from other people. They're the ones other people never bothered to discover about us. My family had spent decades assuming they knew everything there was to know about me, when the truth was they barely scratched the surface. But in the end, that worked out exactly as it should have. They learned to see me as I really was, and I learned to see them as they really could be. The secret that shocked them all wasn't just about money. It was about the power of never underestimating anyone, especially the people you think you know best. And that's a lesson that served us all well in the years since.